Hello, welcome to Conversations with a Wounded Healer. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno. I'm a therapist in Chicago, and I own a group practice called Head Heart Therapy. And the idea behind this podcast was I have really amazing conversations with my friends, and a lot of my friends are therapists and or in recovery and or spiritual healers, and they're all doing some super amazing work. Whenever we talk, I feel really filled and really excited and energized, and I think that the information that we talk about is, I guess, not something that a lot of people talk about. When I did my first podcast interview on Andrea Klunder's The Creative Imposter, the feedback that I got was so overwhelmingly positive, and a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, so vulnerable, and some of the things you said just resonated so much. And I was just thinking, well, my friends and I talk like this all the time. So y'all just need to sit on the couch with us and have a great time. So this is my way of trying to make that happen. My first guest, her name is Audra Kurth, and she is a licensed clinical professional counselor. I think that's what LCPC stands for, and a certified alcohol drug counselor. And she works at a practice called Chicago Mindful Psychotherapy. Audra and I have known each other, I think probably maybe about 5 years now. She is a super special person in my life. She is one of my soul sisters, and the thing that really sold me on Audra, in 2014, we both lost our dads. And it's interesting because my parents both died, and it was 9 months apart when my parents died, and her dad died right in the middle in between when my parents died. And, grief is such an overwhelming emotion and something that's so incredibly personal. And having a parent die, it's like you don't know really who to talk to. People get really freaked out at that thought. And after her dad died, I reached out. I can't even tell you what I said to her, but she was like, let's just hang out and have a grief group of 2. And I was like, fuck yes, that sounds exactly like what I need to do. And there were a couple times where we'd go out to dinner. One time we met in Wells Park because we wanted to do cartwheels. So we had our little grief group of 2. And ever since that happened back in 2014, our relationship has just grown, and she's just a really, really special person to me. And so that's why I wanted her to be number 1 on this podcast, because we always have amazing conversations together. And I knew that the information that we would talk about together might be healing for people, might be interesting. So I do hope you enjoy our interview with Audra, the reluctant sacred spiritual healer. Hello, Audra. How are you?
I'm good, friend. How are you?
I am excellent. So why don't you tell me a little bit about who you are and what you do?
I am a licensed clinical professional counselor. That's LCPC in the state of Illinois. So essentially, I have my master's degree in counseling psychology, and I'm licensed. I also have my CADC, which is Certified Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counselor certification, which means I specialize in addiction. So I'm a therapist in Chicago. I work at a mindfulness-based practice, and I do individual therapy, and I do some DBT groups. That's dialectical behavioral therapy. Man, I feel like I'm swinging with all the letters right off the bat.
That's how we roll.
That's how it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I do all of those things. Primarily, I see people for individual therapy. A lot of people that I see are dealing with addiction or family members of people who are dealing with addiction. But I also have a whole lot of other people who are just struggling with anxiety and depression and relationship issues and all the other lovely things that bring people to therapy.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And for people who might be listening, Audra is one of my very, very dearest friends. And do you want to tell the story of how we met?
Sure. So I was working at a substance abuse treatment center, and Sarah came in to network and market herself, essentially. And she walked into the room, and she had a purple mohawk, and I also had a purple mohawk. And we were like, let's be friends. And it worked.
It worked. And they lived happily forever after.
Mm-hmm. I picture us frolicking with our purple mohawks.
Yes. And we do frolic. So...
Mm-hmm.
Let that stand for the record.
Yeah.
So I asked Audra to be my first interview because I know that Audra is a person who is just as dedicated to her own personal work as she is to helping clients. And because she's my awesome friend, I knew we'd have a lot of great conversations to have with this. So that's why I've asked you. So thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, it's an honor / makes me want to barf a little bit. So
Yay!
I'm glad we're doing this. It's just like doing your own work.
Right? That's perfect. I love it and I want to barf. Perfect. So, my dear Audra, tell me the story of how you decided to become a therapist.
All right. So it's kind of funny because I feel like I ended up in a lot of places in my professional career accidentally. So I grew up, my father was a evangelical Pentecostal preacher. So I grew up in a pretty conservative Christian home, which is interesting because it was full of love and also very strict. And also there's this legacy of helping others, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a pretty crucial, interesting part of my work currently of contending with that background, but we can get into that later. Anyway, so I grew up with being around a lot of people, helping relationship, sense of community. So it was kind of instilled in me, and I was always drawn to wanting to work with people. When I was really young, I was like, I want to be a doctor. And I was like, I got good grades. I'm a perfectionist. So I was all like, I'm going to get my PhD, or I'm going to go get my MD, and I'm going to go heal the sick. And then
just like Jesus.
Oh, yeah, girl. Just... And so, but then I realized I like literally faint at the sight of blood, and even like talking about it and thinking about it is really problematic for me. So it's like, well, that's not really going to work. Plus like the idea of majoring in biology or chemistry, like I think I could have done it. I just didn't really want to. So I was like, I don't know what to do now. This is probably like senior in high school-ish time. When I'm applying to college. So at the time I was taking I think a sociology, probably light psychology class. And I was like, this is pretty cool and interesting. And my mom's like, I think my mom was the one who was like, why don't you major in it? So I was like, okay. So I did. And then I remember my very first class, and I remember the book. There was a book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And it was all about the difference between like humans and other animals and how we essentially create problems in our bodies because of stress. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is fascinating. And I was hooked, right? And like how the mind worked and all that stuff. So that was how I ended up with that. And it was funny too, because then like, I didn't really understand going to graduate school. Like I knew it had to happen, but I didn't know how to prepare for that. And I like picked a graduate school because I was like, I don't know where to go. And I don't want to take the GRE, which I ended up taking anyway. And I don't really want to be too far away from home, which is pretty ironic now.
Right.
So I ended up in graduate school at Valparaiso, and I actually really liked a lot of my professors, and I got some really good experience there. But like reflecting back, I was like, I had no idea what I was doing. I just sort of ended up there. And the same kind of thing there. So I was like, I want to work with women, and I want to like maybe do domestic violence stuff. And I had this whole thing. And then you get into your internships, and I had this really wonderful supervisor, and she was like, what do you not want to do? And I was like, addiction. Like, I don't think I can handle that.
Oh, wow.
Right? I was like, I don't think I can handle that. Like watching people just like struggle and fail and relapse. And it just seems so heartbreaking. And she was like, well, Audra, you need to understand that relapse is a part of all change process. And so if you're seeing a woman who's like trying to leave a domestic violence situation, the average is they go back 7 times before they actually leave. And people with depression, it comes around again, or people engage in problematic behaviors again. So if you can't handle the ups and downs of the change process, then you're not in the right business. And I was like, whoa, so it was a huge moment. And so she's like, I think you should go check out our addictions program.
Wow.
So I did it and I loved it. And I was like, oh my God, I love these people. I love these stories. I love this work. And like immediately I had that, like, this is what I want to do. So that was how I ended up with the addiction stuff. But it's funny because I left, and again, same thing. I moved to Chicago because I had friends here and I wanted to get out of small town America. And I applied for jobs and I did crisis work. I did crisis intervention for 6 years, and it was really amazing. So I ended up there. It wasn't like I didn't have a specialty in that. I had done some like crisis line stuff in college and whatever. And And it was cool. And so, of course, in crisis work, you get tons of substance abuse comes through that situation. And it was cool because I got to like get the whole gamut of mental health. You know, like I was going into SROs, doing assessments on people. I'm like in the emergency room doing assessments on people that the police had brought in. You know, if anything happened in the agency, they would like page me and I would come running to like deal with stuff, which was interesting. So it was cool. I'm really appreciative for that experience. So I got lots of general assessment and understanding of the whole wide world of mental health and the mental health system, which I think is really was very eye-opening for me and highly important. So I did all that for 6 years, which is probably too long, but you know how it is with agency work. I don't know if people out there know how it is with agency work. You get sucked in, you feel like I'm doing the good work, and you kind of have that chip on your shoulder, and I'm in the trenches doing the stuff, but you know, it's ultimately exhausting. So I don't know if I was like full on burnout. There was a lot of changes at the agency, and it was just time. So I left and I was like, I want this addiction thing. I would kind of get all the like more substance abuse prevalent cases that came through anyway. But I was like, I really want to go. So I left and I went to Hazelden, and at the same time I started doing private practice. And so I did that for like a year and a half. And once again, you know, this seems to be a theme. I was like working 6 days a week and I was like, I can't keep up this pace. So I made the leap into private practice and I love it.
Yay!
So that was a really long-winded answer to that short question.
No, I love it. It's perfect.
So I accidentally fell into all this stuff backwards. You know, like I got this job because I just needed a job when I moved to Chicago, right? And I did addictions because I didn't want to do addictions and I loved it. And even same with the, like when I started doing private practice and the mindfulness stuff, my boss was like, well, she had been my boss at the mental health agency, and then she left and started doing private practice. And she was like, I have this vision. I want to like have like a private practice and I want it to be mindfulness based. And I'm sort of like, oh, I feel like you kind of talked about that. Like, what's mindfulness? And she was like, yeah, it's really important. And her philosophy and now our group's philosophy is like mindfulness is not just this tool that you teach people in therapy. Like it is a way of being, it is a lifestyle, and we will practice what we preach. And so it was great because she was like, hey, come to this mindfulness meditation workshop.
Is that the Turgar one?
Well, Amy from Turgar and Georgia ran it together. So it was a combination of that. And I feel like a lot of it was based on like Sharon Salzberg's stuff, and Turgar's stuff was kind of like the blend. So it was like a full thing. And it was like, oh, okay, this is meditation, which was all brand new to me. I'm like, all right, this is cool. So I was like, yeah, sure. I'll start doing this. In. Right. So it was kind of like, hey, you have to do this in order to work here. And I was like, oh, okay. And then now it's been this like revolutionary, important, life-changing thing for me. So once again, Audra, falling into all of these ways of being.
Yeah. And since you talk about, you know, mindfulness as a lifestyle, can you maybe explain a little bit what that looks like for you, and maybe also some things that you suggest for your clients?
Sure. Wow, that's a big question.
Yeah.
Yeah. For me, mindfulness is being woke, like wake up.
Holla.
Right? Like wake up to the sensations in your body, wake up to your thought process, wake up to how all of that influences your behavior, wake up to the experience of people around you and the world around you, right? And be present with all of it, you know. And they talk about mindfulness being like there's two wings of the bird of it. And one half is like attention and noticing, and the other half is compassion. So it's not just, it's waking up, but like holding everything with some like gentleness, kindness, curiosity, and compassion. So it's trying to live life that way, right? And it happens formally and informally. So formally is like the full on sitting down with yourself with formal meditation practices. And there's a million of those. And then also the rest of it is like trying to be as fully present as possible with the rest of it, like not shying away from hard things and fully appreciating and noticing all of the beautiful, wonderful things and everything in between. It also is like how I attempt to show up in the room with a client of like, can I be fully present to everything that they're bringing in and all the garbage that I'm bringing in? And be willing to like name it and talk about it and deal with it. So I guess that's my maybe smallest nutshell version of that. There's a lot of complexities to all of that, but.
Right. But I like the idea of woke. You know, I feel like in society, we have, I guess, kind of awoken to the idea that authenticity is really important. But I think authenticity can also be used as a weapon. And like the term woke, I feel like is thrown around so flippantly, and also authenticity is too, right? Because I mean, I know you and I are on the same political spectrum, and knowing that Donald Trump is a, raving narcissist. And when people say, oh, he's so authentic because he calls it like it is, like that's not authenticity. That's narcissism and a lack of couth. So
Ooh, nice word.
Oh, thanks. So I'm not sure, your thoughts on how you cultivate, and this is another big question, like how you cultivate for yourself that, in Buddhism, the idea of clear seeing, right? So how do you know when you're tapping into that authentic woke part of yourself versus when maybe an imposter tries to show up?
Yeah, that is a big question, but quick answers to that are one, like do your own work, right? So I guess let's start with like formal meditation practice. That's really hard, right? And I started with all the mindfulness stuff maybe like 4 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago now is when that all would have started, right? And it has been incredibly challenging for me to maintain like a daily consistent practice. I go in and out and in and out and in and out and wrestle with it, right? And so eventually I have an accountability partner now, Amy, who is the Turgar lady who is also in our practice, who's amazing. And I are meditation partners, right? And so, partners is a strong word, but we text each other every day. I did my 20 minutes. This is what I'm doing it on, or I want to do this. And then we also have space to sort of process what's going on in our experiences. And that has been enormously helpful for me. So anyway, back to being woke and authentic. I mean, the more you sit with yourself, the more you learn, and you can't hide from that shit. So when you sit, you notice all of your shit and you have to reckon with it and deal with it, right? And so I feel like that feeds authenticity of like when you know your patterns, then you can name them really quickly and you become aware of them. Oh, this is my perfectionist showing up, or this is my like teacher self showing up because I want to escape being vulnerable right now, or this is my angry teenager stomping her feet. That kind of stuff happens with practice, and then also doing therapy, right? Like your own therapy, like seeing a therapist. And group therapy has been a new thing in my world, or group processing has been a new thing. And as I feel like really cracked things open, I feel like it's been maybe more powerful than some of my individual work. Like when I think back to like group experiences that I've had, it's been pretty incredible. Not to say that individual work, it's fun. The individual therapist is being like, group is way better.
Yeah, right. But I mean, there's something to be said to pull back, when we do groups with clients, we know that the empathy and the connection and all of that experience is so much more powerful for them than anything that we could say. So of course, when we have group experiences, it's going to be profound if you're digging in and doing your shit.
Totally. So I feel like the whole like getting woke business is like, when you do your own work, then like you can't not notice it walking around in your life, and which is the beautiful curse of awareness. Like sometimes I'm so mad at it. Like I hate awareness. Like I don't want to know this right now. I don't want to have to do the work of dealing with this. Right. And I think that's the same thing with like therapy. You can't unknow something.
Right. Yep. I've always said that to clients going through treatment. Like you're getting this education and you will never unknow this. And so you will never not be uncomfortable by your quote unquote bad behavior anymore, because you can't close your mind to it.
Right. Which is, the best worst. I have other thoughts about the whole, because you brought up the authenticity thing. And I feel like that's a really important, like it's this thing that like eats at me a little bit, which we have talked to some degree about, but let me unpack a little bit more. Ugh. I like saying that word unpack. It feels so therapist-y. Anyway.
Guess what? You're a therapist, by the way.
I know. So in being part of a mindfulness practice and also doing DBT and ACT, all that's like third wave psychology, which is all very Buddhist thinking.
Acceptance and commitment therapy.
Yes, thank you. You get exposed to these Buddhist ideas like no self. Right. And the happiness trap. And I feel like there's kind of been this trend of like authenticity and finding your authentic self and finding your true voice and standing in your truth, which on a very basic level, I totally believe in. But I also believe that rigidly attaching to idea of self, like self is so fluid and it changes so much. And I feel like authentic true self is kind of taken over the like good enough narrative. And I feel like people, like you were saying, use it as a weapon against themselves. Like, you know, like I follow all this stuff on like social media and these like empowering things and therapist things and whatever. And it feels like to me, there's this whole like, we got to stop body shaming ourselves. And, you know, we got to start using our voices and taking up space and all of those kinds of things, which I agree with. But there's this like very sneaky element of like, am I standing in my truth? Am I being my authentic self? And people beating themselves up. And it kind of is this new way of chasing being enough and good and right. And I was like, oh, like that's not it, you know? And so it's hard for me because I feel like there's so much good messaging in that, but I also feel like there's this like edge of the be more, be enough. Like I can't tell you how many clients roll in, like when I, you know, I'll be like, hey, maybe you should read The Gifts of Imperfection or Radical Acceptance or Self-Compassion. And then they come in and they're like, I haven't read this and I'm failing at this, or I'm reading this book, or I want to do this, or I got to do this stuff. And like, it just becomes like being authentic suddenly becomes a new measure of that. And it's a problem.
Yeah, no, that is a really good point. And I had a client once, I mean, she was reading all the self-help books and she came in one day and she's like, why aren't they working? Like, why doesn't this work for me? And I feel like some of the books, and I, like the ones that you mentioned, like Gifts of Imperfection and Radical Acceptance, I think those are different, but some of the like more pop psychology self-help books, like, I don't know, there's one I'm thinking of, but I probably shouldn't say the name of it, but it's basically like, you can be whatever you want to be and you can do whatever you want to do, but you know what? Not everybody can. And that's not because they're not capable, but whatever their circumstances in their life, they may not be able to get to, you know, be a CEO of $1 trillion company. I don't think everyone has that capacity. And it's bullshit to try to sell this idea. And going back to the woke thing, like, is there a place where you're going to be able to be 100% authentic all the time and standing in your truth? Probably not.
Well, and like, what does that mean? Because it literally changes moment to moment to moment. Like, I could be totally overcome with like a deep sense of insecurity, right? Of like, oh my God, like even like right now we're doing this interview and I'm like, I can switch from moment to moment where I'm feeling like, wow, that's like really useful. And I'm so glad I'm saying these things. And that sounds really great. And then there's this other part where I'm like, oh my God, you're talking too much about nothing, or this is terrible, or whatever. So am I secure or am I insecure? Am I confident or not? And I feel like people quickly are going to be like, no, Audra, your truth is that you have things to offer and take up space. But the truth is that I'm also insecure too. I'm both,
right.
Which is, you know, that is the essence of dialectics, is like sort of containing a seemingly opposing truth at the same time. Or as I like to think about it, is like getting comfortable with the fact that we're all hypocritical and all of life is. So deal with it. And I guess maybe that's like that moment to moment to moment of changing. And that's why I kind of like the notion of compassion a little bit more, is like, all of this is going to happen. And can I just contain and compassionately be with all of the tumbling through all of the ways of being that will show up?
Right. Yeah. Well, and this kind of moves to one of the questions that I wanted to ask about, you know, how you manage your own authenticity and vulnerability in terms of work, and how that may or may not be different when you show up in real life. You know, we've certainly talked about your relationship with Phil, your husband, and how things, you know, that happen in group then show up with him and all of that. So can you talk a little bit about that authenticity, vulnerability, I guess?
As a therapist?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. This one's like hard because I feel like I want to go to like the whole, like the dialectics of thing, because I do want to show up with people. And I believe that like we are having a genuine relationship, and like, you know, people are wounded in relationships, so people heal in relationship. Right.
Agreed.
And everybody can feel fakeness, or like when you take too much distance, you know, people can feel that when you're keeping up a wall or distance. And also I can't like, you know, merge and mesh with people either. So trying to find that middle ground of that closeness. So I do a lot of using my own reaction to people in real time, which I think is vulnerable and revealing of myself and appropriate, right? So you know, like someone will say something and I'm like, you know, I'll be like, pause. That's one of my favorite things. I'm like, pause, hold on, stop, time out. You know, like, you know, like what's happening in your body? Like my chest is like so tight right now, or I feel like I'm going to vomit or whatever. Right. So I'll, you know, use my own reaction to try to help them get into theirs, which I feel like is very authentic.
Yes.
You know, I get teary-eyed with clients.
Yeah.
frequently, and I've cried with clients too. I mean, that one doesn't happen as often. I feel like I get teary-eyed frequently, because like the body feels stuff and it resonates in that whole like mirror neurons and empathy, like it's going to happen. And I think it's really useful. So that is probably one of the biggest ways. And I can't hide my facial expressions very well. So there's also a lot of like, I'll be listening, and whatever. And they'll be like, what is with your face? Like your face right now. And I'm like, oh shit. Okay. Here's what I'm thinking. Right. Mm-hmm. And like self-disclosure, I try to use, like anything appropriately, sparingly. Like if I think if it's in their own best interest and it's going to help them, I might share something about myself. And there's also this kind of easing in and easing out of the therapy space with people, the small talk sort of stuff. I know some of, quote, authentic Audra leaks in and out of the entering and exiting, some of that space. So that's there. And the other issue that's in all of this that I don't quite know how to reconcile is the idea of loving clients.
Oh, yeah.
And I've had a lot of conversations with my colleagues about this recently, and it's a scary word to say. Like, I feel like there's this like, you're not supposed to love your clients, and you're sure not supposed to say, I love you too, clients, right? And it just feels like old school ideas about like holding boundaries, which I also believe in too, right? And like the way that I love them is limited to the space that we're in. We see them an hour a week, sometimes maybe more, right? So there's an artificialness to the love, even if it's really authentic, right? Or maybe artificialness isn't the right word, but maybe limits. It has limits, even though sometimes it feels very boundless within me. Like, I love my clients. It's like a joke around the office, like if we're ever consulting, like I'm immediately like, so this client, I love them. I love him. I love her,
Yes.
Like, I'm always the one who's like, I love. Like, I love them, and I like love other people's clients. Like, just like they're in the lobby waiting to see somebody else. And we have these like mini interactions and I'm like, oh my God, I love her. And I think that's part of one of my gifts as a therapist is that I love very easily.
Yes.
And I mean it. That's a hard thing for some of my clients to like trust and accept, right?
Yes.
But I also don't use that word ever with anybody. I've only one time with one client.
Really?
We were terminating. It was a beautiful relationship, and we were terminating, and we had talked it through, and we hugged goodbye, and he said, I love you. Or maybe like, I love you. And I was like, I love you too, and it was beautiful. And it was like the first time, and I was like, oh my God, I uttered the words to a client.
Yeah. Like, was I allowed to do that?
Going to therapist jail.
Right. Well, I got a call last night from a therapist in San Francisco, and I never pick up the phone. I don't know who I assumed it was. And I picked up the phone and she's like, oh, hey, I am seeing, X old client of yours. And I was just like, oh my God, I love X. How's she doing? And after I was talking more with the therapist and, she was just kind of asking about the history of this client and, what would be helpful in her work moving forward. And she's like, oh my God, where are you from? Because most therapists do not talk to me like this. You're so authentic and you're so straight to the point. And, and she was like so appreciative of the honesty and the realness. And I think we do love our clients, and it would be such a disservice to us and the clients if we didn't recognize that, and express it in appropriate ways. I've been in that situation a number of times where a client will say, I love you. And I mean, when I know that I feel it, I say it back. Of course I love you too. And, this relationship is very important to me, and you help me as much as you think I help you, It is a two-way street. And I don't think that our clients really understand what that's like, to really be honored to be a witness for someone and to also be changed by them without them even knowing that they're doing it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, it's an awesome job.
I know. I love it.
Same. As I was preparing for There's this book that I read called Mindful Therapy by a guy named Thomas Bien.
Yes, I haven't finished it yet.
He talks about this. He talks about the idea of like, of course, and this gets into the whole like doing attachment therapy, but he's like, we penetrate their psyches and they penetrate ours. And if we're in like deep attached relationship with people, of course, we're going to think about them outside of session. And this is all the caveat that you're not like obsessing about them and having these fantastical, intense fantasy relationships with them. But it's weird where I'm like, well, of course, like this thing reminds me of this client and I would think about it. Or like after a session when there's these things, like I would mull it over. Like he's like, of course you do. And I think that's important. Right. And he also talks about this idea that like, you know, we kind of hold this sense of self and completeness for them until they're ready to have that for themselves, which is a big burden. And he also talks about being a healer guru, and like that stuff is like awesome. / like I read this book and I literally threw it on the floor a couple of times and I read it because I was like, I can't handle hearing this from you, Thomas.
So funny.
So I don't know if you want to segue into that, if you feel like we covered all the stuff, but it all sort of connects for me.
Yeah. So move into that then, because, you know, the name of the podcast is Conversations with a Wounded Healer. And so we've danced around it, but haven't like really, I guess, driven it home straight to the point. But so if you think about that term for yourself, wounded healer, how does that apply to you?
So definitely a couple different branches on this thought. I have like a strong negative reaction to the word wounded healer because of course we all are. We're human beings. And so all of us are wounded, right? We all have different wounds from lots of different things. Like nobody comes out unscathed out of anything, right?
Right.
And it bothers me because wounded feels like active. Like I have an active gaping wound and then I'm going to go help other people who are also wounded. And that seems inappropriate, right?
Right, yeah.
So then I'm like, well, maybe it's like scarred healer. And I feel much more like I'm a scarred healer because scars means that the tissue has repaired itself, that the organism has repaired itself, and there's marks and I know them. And I like that idea better. That's not to say like I don't have wounds or I don't get wounded or that it's like, you know, whatever, like the work's never done, right? You keep doing the process and you keep revisiting, but this has been laid to rest. Like I've done this and I've let this go. And of course I can pick it up, or of course, developmentally down the road, I might revisit this with a new lens, whatever. But I feel like sometimes there's this need to identify with our pathology or our need to over-identify with clients' pathology and like live in that space and pick at that space and wallow in that space. And I don't like it.
Yeah.
And I think it's important being like actively wounded and sharing space with somebody when you have this, you know, great burden of holding so much burden / privilege of holding all this stuff for them. Like that's dangerous, yo.
Yeah. I mean, I've certainly worked with other therapists, whether they be colleagues or people as my clients, and just thinking like, wow, the burden that you're carrying right now is so great. How are you possibly carrying somebody else's? And that's tough.
Right. It's funny because I feel like we all talk about it as therapists, but does anybody actually say, you know what, I can't carry this for you right now. Or you know what, I'm burned out. I need to do this.
Right.
I also feel like that ties in with the whole thing of we all say, you know, not everybody's a good fit.
Yeah.
Have you ever like with a client been like, I'm not a good fit for you and referred them to somebody else?
I have.
Like,
I have.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I haven't. There was one person that I'm like, I think I probably should have, and I didn't. And that's not entirely true. I feel like sometimes things have emerged and I'm like, dude, this is outside my scope. I think you need something different. But fit full on, just like I can handle what you're bringing, but we're not a good fit. I don't know if I've done that.
Yeah, only one. There was one time where the issue is definitely out of my scope. And also the reason that this person was seeking therapy from me, it was very clear that the motives were more about sexuality than anything else. But then there was one client where it was like, there's no chemistry here, which like sounds kind of silly, right? Because we're not dating. But if there's no spark in the relationship of the therapeutic relationship, then you're going to run out of stuff to talk about, right? And it's not going to feel like you're getting anywhere.
Totally. So I know that was like a weird side digression, but it's like a thing.
No, I love it.
Like, I don't feel like anybody like talks about that idea of like, are we actually a good fit, and like kind of giving that up. And I'm particularly sensitive to this because I do DBT. And so I see lots of folks with borderline personality disorder. I feel like people only do that of like, it's not a good fit if the therapist doesn't want to deal with that person's presentation, you know? And so I'm like, fuck you, that's a cop out. And ultimately it is a good thing, because if you don't want to deal with whatever this person brings to the table, fine. But like, I just feel like it's so, sometimes there's this attitude of like shaming, you know, that can happen in addiction or just regular whatever, of like, oh, they weren't ready yet, or they need a higher level of care. You know, blah, 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 blah. And like, they blame the client for their stuff instead of just being like, yeah, I can't do this.
Right. Because in real harm reduction work, it's not the client's resistance. It's, this is where the client is right now, and we have to transform and help them with where they are instead of wanting to fit them to where we are.
Totally. That's one of the defining principles of DBT is the client doesn't fail. Like the therapist fails the client, essentially, which I was like, oh, damn, that was a hard truth to swallow. Like, I was first learning all of that, but like, it makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
So like with the wounded healer part, so that's one thing where I'm like over-identifying with the wound is a problem. I think ongoing work is absolutely important. And I think, you know, our wounds help us relate better to people, right? And this is a really hard dialectic of like, you don't need to go through the same experience as your clients in order to help them.
Right.
And it helps sometimes to have been like, oh yeah, I get that. I understand that process of change, or I understand what I'm asking you to do because I've done it myself.
Right.
Right. That is important. And that is kind of challenging. And the other part of that phrase, wounded healer, is the word healer, which carries a lot of stuff, you know, so like circling back to my family, I've had to reckon with that, you know, like I, in late teens, was able to be like, this is not at all what I want, like these religious beliefs and values and system. And so I chose to go my own path with that. Right. And so like most people, when you're trying to get out of a situation, you swing from one pendulum to the one side to the other. Right. And so I've put a lot of distance between myself and my family's identity as Christians, right? Conservative Christians. I don't believe Christian ideology, and I do believe a lot of Buddhist stuff, which is like uncomfortably hard for me to admit out loud in a public forum. Here we go. Talk about vulnerability. But I'm coming to this place of like trying to reconcile with like who my family was and accepting all of that. Right. And my father's grandfather was a preacher, and my brother is a preacher, and my mom just got ordained. And so there's this whole like legacy of like spiritual healers. And I'm a part of that, and probably part of why I'm good in certain ways of occupying this space with people and easily loving people is from that. I'm going to cry. Like, that's what my dad was really good at. He loved people very easily. He was much kinder than I am, you know, so it's really hard for me to accept and allow that, right? Because I've had to put so much distance, and I'm doing this work now of trying to sort out what was theirs and leaving that, but like, what can I take from it, and what is that of mine, right? And I know this goes back to the Thomas B. N. guy, where he talks about this legacy of like, we're not just a legacy of scientists, but also of philosophers and healers and gurus, and that this is a sacred thing. And, you know, we need to embrace all of that, all of what we're doing with people, you know, when we talk about the transformative work of therapy.
And you are a sacred spiritual healer. It just is in a different form than your family. Right.
I had like a situation, I'm like,
yeah. Talk about barf, right?
Right. Letting those words settle. Like my whole body's like, whoa, rigid against that. Right. Yeah. So that's like part of where I am right now. And, you know, it's funny, ironic, maybe the word, I don't know.
Isn't it ironic?
Don't you think? Talking about wounded healer, these are my wounds and my legacy, and it's all at the same time, right? Ooh. Yeah.
Ooh, girl.
Doing the work.
Girl, we get
work.
Deep.
Trying to do the work.
Yes.
Dipping my toe in and running away.
Yeah. But you do it. You show up fully. I'm not going to say like
Thank you.
fully in your truth, but you show up fully. For me, for Phil, your husband, for your friends, for your clients. And it's so wonderful to have you and your light in my life.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So I think we've gotten some good shit.
There was one other thing that went through my head that like way back we talked about how do you stay woke? And I don't know. And I think I spoke to it, but I just wanted to like make sure I spoke to the idea of body awareness is a really, really important thing. Like I remember when I first started meditating, like doing body scans, I was like, this is so weird. Why does it matter what I feel in my big toe? This is so dumb.
Right.
And then as you move over time, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so much nuance in my body is telling me so much. And all of the research that's coming out and like somatic experiencing and like yoga therapy and trauma work and the body keeps the score. Like, hello, listen to your body. The body is more powerful than words sometimes at healing. So I also try to pay attention and listen to my body sensations quite a bit, which is how I try to be woke in my life. And I also practice yoga, which is also one of those. I love it. And then I'm also like, cringe, like, oh, I feel like such a cliche. 2 to 3 times. It is magical.
But it's magical.
It is magical. So being in my body.
Yeah. Just because we've westernized it doesn't mean that it doesn't work anymore.
I think it's just like sometimes when I start piling up all of the things that are true about me and then they turn into a like liberal North Side white woman stereotype box. I'm like, oh Christ. Like, I'm like, I'm going to yoga after eating my avocado and my AeroPressed coffee while listening to NPR. Yeah, let's do this podcast. Oh God. Anyone hate me?
Amazing.
Sorry.
Amazing.
Whatever. There's that.
I love it. And is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you want to share today?
The only other thing that we had talked about, which I don't know how this fits and if it fits or whatever, is the idea of where the addiction field is and where it's going and where we're focusing on stuff. And I just feel very strongly about continuing to be progressive in my ideology about that and wanting therapists in the field to catch up to those things. And like having, I personally have some pretty liberal views about drugs. And like, I feel like the war on drugs is incredibly damaging and ineffective and totally worthless. Bullshit. Right. And even just kind of some of our ways of approaching treatment historically are really ineffective. And so I'm just, a big champion of, can we have some new ways of approaching this? And can we talk about these things? And can we stop being terrified of these things? There's these strange puritanical views, I think, sometimes in our society about substances and about sex, which is a whole other topic.
That's a whole other podcast.
It's a whole other podcast for sure. But I feel like they inform a lot of the way that policy works. And it's like really ineffective. And it's like addiction is its own thing. Like drugs and sex and alcohol, like they have their dangers and risks, but that's not the problem. Like the problem is our society, like not being connected and not giving our children what they need and not addressing the trauma in our society on so many levels and all of this other stuff. So addiction grows from that. And so I feel like people want to chase and demonize certain things and have this quote war on drugs. And then I'm like, that's not what we need. We need like revolution about trauma and connection in our world. Like that's what we need.
Well, and if, people listening haven't seen Johann Hari's TED Talk, Everything You Know About Addiction is Wrong, Google it immediately. Have you seen it?
I don't know.
Girl, because basically everything that you're saying is exactly what he says. And his book, Chasing the Scream, is all about how the war on drugs has failed and it sucks. And it's all about morality and racism instead of actually being about the truth, which is we need connection.
Right. Well, and I also being in the whole like Buddhist and mindfulness, like world of things, there's a lot of like conversations about like the historical use of like psychedelics and spiritual experiences. And there's this research about using MDMA with trauma and helping people have corrective emotional experiences. And I'm like, please, can we open up these channels? Like, clearly, like, addiction treatment fails a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. You know what I mean? And like, even like trauma stuff, like our world, people are just living out there with stuff. And it's like, can we please be more progressive and like open up to these new ideas? You know, people need the help. So mini soapbox on that for a minute. I
dig. We're on the same soapbox. We can share it.
Yay. And we'll frolic up to it and hug each other on the soapbox.
Yay! Everything can be healed with love and unicorns.
As long as we're allowed to say fuck.
Exactly. Well, my dear, this has been so wonderful, and I cannot tell you how much I appreciate your time.
I'm happy to give it. I'm sure I will have like a intense vulnerability hangover, and you know, I probably won't listen to the podcast.
As you were talking though, as you were talking, and I was like really listening and thinking, like, oh my God, she's gonna love this when she hears it back. So maybe I can encourage you one day to listen.
Maybe this scarred healer will be willing to look at her shit. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's an honor, and I love you.
I love you.
And I love this work we do, sister.
Amen. Thanks to my wonderful guest, Audra Kurth, to Andrea Klunder for editing, Liam O'Donnell for taking that rad photo for the album art, and to Ben Mueller for our theme music. For more information on Audra and her practice, Chicago Mindful Psychotherapy, you can visit my website at www.headhearttherapy.com/Sarah's-blog. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Sarah Bueno. Until next time, bye-bye.